kidnapped. In the great forest, close to the city of Kampilya, lived an elderly widow. The old woman, whose husband had died many years ago, managed to eke out a frugal living by collecting medicinal herbs, which she sold in the city. Late one night, the old woman was awakened by the sound of horsemen outside her cottage. Before she could get to her feet, there was a loud knock on the door. When she opened the door, she was startled to see a number of men, all heavily armed. Without saying a word, they pushed her and crowded into the cottage. "What do you want?" asked the old woman timidly. "It is all right, mother," said one of the men, who by his attire and bearing was the leader. "From now onwards, you will prepare food for my men every night. You will be well paid, but breathe a word of our existence, and you will never see the next sunrise." The old woman was far too frightened to refuse or even argue, and from that night onwards, she cooked food for 10 men, who came silently in the hours of darkness, ate the food, and departed. Although the money they paid her was more than she had ever seen before, her life was uneasy, for there were many ugly rumors of robbing and murder taking place in the city every night. At that time, Kampilya was ruled by King Satyavarman, a powerful ruler and a great warrior. The king had a daughter, the comely Princess Sundari, and because of her great beauty and her father's vast kingdom, there was no lack of suitors for her hand in marriage. The most persistent suitor was the arrogant and cruel Chandavarnam, king of Suvir, but his debaucheries were the talk of the land, so the princess treated him with utter contempt. So enraged was Chandavarnam that he swore that come what may, he would possess this proud princess, even if he had to resort to force. Another suitor was the charming Prince Avanish, whose father ruled a small kingdom in eastern India. When the prince met the princess, they were both taken with each other, but the prince ruefully felt that, coming from an almost penniless kingdom, his chances of winning the princess were rather forlorn. One evening, the disconsolate prince was wandering through the forest when he chanced to pass the old woman's hut. Feeling thirsty, he stopped and asked the old woman for a drink of water. When he went inside the cottage, he was rather intrigued at the sight of a very large pot of food cooking on the stove. "You must have a big family to feed," said the prince, pointing to the pot. "Yes," replied the old woman, "I have 10 men to feed tonight. But thank goodness, they say they will be leaving for somewhere in the north." "Who are these men?" he asked. "I wish I knew," said the woman dubiously. "Ever since they have been coming here, there have been terrible murders and violence in the city. I fear that they are wicked, and shall be glad when they have gone for good." The prince could see that the old woman was uneasy, and seemed to be listening for the sound of her mysterious men to return. "It would certainly be interesting to meet these men." So giving a prodigious yawn, the prince asked, "As it is getting late, mother, can I stay here for the night?" The old woman threw up her arms in dismay. "You must go. If these men find you here, they may very well kill us both, so please go." The prince tried to console the woman and promised to come and see her again. When he left the cottage, he did not go very far. Selecting a big shady tree, the prince climbed to a branch that gave a good view of the cottage and made himself comfortable to await the return of the old woman's unwelcome guests. Around midnight, he heard horses coming through the forest, and he watched the 10 men dismount outside the cottage. There were 2 pack horses. On one, there appeared to be a large bundle, and on the other, 2 casks. "Must be wine," he thought, as 2 of the men unroped the casks and carried them into the cottage. As soon as the men were inside, the prince descended from his lofty perch and, keeping to the shadows, approached the cottage. There wasn't much need for stealth, for the men had already started drinking, and their shouting and singing would drown any sound he would make. Looking at the horses, the prince was sure that the men had not covered any great distance, and eyeing the bundle on the pack horse, the prince wondered what it could contain. When he felt the bundle, he was sure it was a human being trussed up in a blanket. Carefully lifting down the bundle, the prince quickly undid the covering, and to his astonishment, inside, Gagged and bound hand and foot was Princess Sundari. Removing the gag, the prince whispered to the princess not to make a noise. Then as he loosened the rope she was tied with, she told him in a few hurried words how these men had abducted her from the palace. The prince weighed up the possibilities of taking 2 of the rogue's horses and making a run for it. Then he had a better idea. "It is of no use attempting to escape now," he told the princess. "Those rogues might overtake us, then your life would be in danger. You hide in the bushes, and when the rogues have gone, go into the cottage and the old woman there will look after you until I return." Once the princess was safely hidden from view, the prince wrapped the blanket around himself and managed to hoist himself across the back of the pack horse, fervently hoping that the rogues would be too bemused with drink to examine their precious cargo. Soon afterwards, the rogues came reeling out of the cottage, and several were so drunk that they had to be assisted onto their horses. Deep into the forest they rode, and the prince was glad when at last they stopped at an old, disused hut. 2 of the men lifted the bundle off the pack horse, and with curses as to its weight, carried it into the hut. The prince dare not move, and after what seemed an age, all he could hear were loud snores. So apparently the rogues had decided to sleep off all the wine they had consumed. Carefully wriggling out of the blanket, the prince made sure that all the men were asleep. Once outside the hut, the prince selected the fastest-looking horse, and getting onto its back, rode at a full gallop for the palace at Kampilya. When he arrived there, the whole palace was in a turmoil. The princess had vanished, and already search parties were scouring the city, and the king's cavalry were ready to search the forest. Making straight for the king, who was surrounded by ministers all talking at once, the prince intervened. "Your Majesty, the princess is safe, and I will take you to her. But first, let me lead your men to where the rogues, who kidnapped her, are sleeping." The king wasted no time in asking for an explanation, and soon a strong body of cavalry, led by the king with the prince at his side, were galloping through the forest. The rogues, still befuddled with sleep, offered little resistance and were soon overpowered. The leader of the band, with the king's sword at his throat, was only too eager, in the hope of mercy, to confess that King Chandavarnam had promised them a huge sum to abduct the princess. "I will see the wretch pays," said the king angrily. Then, turning to one of officers, he ordered, "Take these felons and hang them." Later, the king and the prince rode to the old woman's cottage, where they found the princess safe and happy in the care of the old woman. As soon as they returned to the palace, the king ordered his army to conquer the kingdom of Suvir and to bring him King Chandavarnam dead or alive. As it turned out, the Suvir army mutinied at the sight of the vast invading army, and the despicable Chandavarnam was slaughtered by his own men. Not long afterwards, the prince and the princess were happily married, and the king gave a pension to the old woman of the forest.